Jovan Buha! Buha!
Yo, I'm Jovan Buha, Lakers beat writer for The Athletic, and welcome to another episode of Buha's Block. On today's show, we're going to be covering one lesson the Lakers can learn from each of the four conference finalists. The NBA is a copycat league, and I think there are always things to take away from the roster construction or the style of play from the teams that make it to the Final Four. So for those who have been following me for a while, I did this episode last year as well. It is something actually replicable that the Lakers can do from these teams and their roster builds or their style of play or their versatility, some element of these teams. So I will be covering that in today's show. But before we get started, you guys know the drill. For those watching on YouTube, please be sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on channel notifications, and like and comment on this video. For those listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice, please be sure to follow, download, and leave a 5-star review. Okay, so lesson number one is from the New York Knicks, and it is the heliocentric blueprint. And now what I mean by that is if you look at the way that these four teams are constructed, the Knicks, the Thunder, the Timberwolves, and the Pacers, I think the Knicks are the roster that is most replicable for the Lakers. If you look at it, they have a heliocentric star. Knicks have Jalen Brunson, Lakers have Luka Doncic, and they're not very deep. The Knicks have played 7 players in true Tibbs fashion, and the Lakers kind of got to 7, depending on which half of basketball it was, but we're somewhere around 7, maybe 8 tops in terms of guys that JJ Redick trusted in the playoffs. So you just look at that foundation, and I think there are some similarities there, and it's easier to say get to 7 players like the Knicks rather than get to 12 players like the Thunder or 10 or 11 players like the Pacers, right? So I'm trying to be realistic here in terms of how the Lakers build their roster. And I think the Knicks are the blueprint for how LA should approach things. If you look at the core of these rosters, they are heliocentric stars who have defensive deficiencies. And I would argue that Luka Doncic is a better defender than Jalen Brunson, if for no other reason than his size. He's a legit 6'7", 6'8", with 240, 250 plus frame that allows him to be an effective help defender and drive deterrent off the ball. And on the ball, he can be targeted, he can be blown by, but just because of basketball is a size game to some extent, and Luka has a certain level of size that Jalen Brunson just does not have. And I would also argue that Luka Doncic is better than Jalen Brunson. I know Jalen has had an incredible playoff run, but Luka overall, I would still take over Jalen. So Lakers have a better starting point on both sides of the ball when looking at Luka compared to Jalen. Then it comes down to the rest of the group. And if you look at how New York has empowered Jalen Brunson, they've given him the best stretch 5 in the game in Karl Anthony Towns, another all-star, all-NBA level co-star. Then they have a bunch of 3-and-D perimeter guys: OG Anunoby, Mikal Bridges, Josh Hart, Deuce McBride. Then you also have the imposing interior force in Mitchell Robinson, and he has some offensive limitations, especially with his free throw shooting, but he is a legitimate presence on both sides of the glass as a rim protector and as the true center on this roster. So from a Lakers perspective, I think getting more guys like OG Anunoby, Mikal Bridges, Josh Hart, Deuce McBride, two-way guys who can hit open threes, who can defend multiple positions, who are tough, who are high motor, who are athletic in varying degrees for each player, but they each fill a specific role on this group. And it's really like the weak points for the Knicks defense are Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns, 2 of their stars, which you could argue for the Lakers, looking at like maybe Luka and Austin Reeves. Those are the 2 entry points to the defense that teams are going to target. But then you surround them with a certain level of size, athleticism, length, strength, motor, and just defensive capability. And I think the Lakers need to do a better job of that next season. And I think the Knicks are the blueprint of give Luka the pick and roll partner, could be pick and pop, pick and roll. He prefers the vertical lob threat, but give him that center, give him that athletic rim protecting, rim running guy, and then give him a lot of 3-and-D type wings and guys who can cover for him defensively, guys who have a certain level of athleticism and motor, guys who can spot up, guys who can attack closeouts. And I think looking at the current builds, the Lakers obviously have the offensive advantage with the Knicks don't have a LeBron James. For as great as Karl Anthony Towns is, he's not LeBron James. The Knicks don't have even an Austin Reeves. For as good as Mikal Bridges or OG Anunoby are offensively, they are not the ball handler or playmaker or even shot creator that Austin Reeves is. And so the Lakers have a better starting point offensively, but they have to catch up on the defensive end. And it's okay if Luka is your worst defender, but you're going to need a point of attack guy. You're going to need a wing defender. You're going to need a rim protector, right? Because those types of guys will help the Lakers compete in the postseason athletically, physically, defensively, give them a true stopper type against an Ant or a guy that can at least bother him more than a Rui, a Dorian Finney-Smith, and Austin Reeves. So the Lakers have to be looking at that and saying, we don't have these types of guys. Like Rui's playing out of position. He's a 4. He's playing at the 3. He's held up fairly well given some of his physical limitations, but he is not an OG Anunoby or Mikal Bridges. Dorian Finney-Smith, maybe a few years ago, could have done some of those things, but he is much more of a 4 or 5 defender who has been miscast as sometimes a 2 or 3 defender. And Jared Vanderbilt just comes with too many offensive limitations, especially compared to some of those guys where he can fill a certain bench role as a wing stopper, but you need a guy who can play 30 plus, 35 plus minutes, and the Lakers just don't have that guy right now. I think the Knicks are what the Lakers should be trying to emulate in terms of how to best support Luka Doncic. And also a realistic model, because I'm not saying you need to get 10 guys, 12 guys to have this build. It's about getting to like 7, maybe 8. And I think the Lakers have some guys that fit within this right now tentatively, but it is about finding probably another 2 to 3, maybe even 4 guys to reshape this rotation. And if they can do that, I think they'll be in a much better position going into next season and beyond. Lesson number 2 is from the Oklahoma City Thunder, and it is the power of identity. And much has been made about the Thunder and who their number 2 truly is. Is it J-Dub? Is it Chet? And each guy has had his moments along the way to get to the Western Conference Finals. But I think the true number 2 with the Oklahoma City Thunder is their defense. And right now, they are allowing 101.6 points per 100 possessions, which is the lowest defensive rating since the 2016 Spurs. So we got to go back 9 years. And that is minimum 8 games, because I think the Magic had like a 100 defensive rating one year. Well, they only played a 7-game series. But so you got to go back 9 years to find a defense playing at this level. And that's also with the increased scoring league wide, right? So as we've seen, offensive ratings have continued to go up, but the Thunder have a historic defense right now. But arguably the craziest thing with their defense is, again, 101.6 points per 100 possessions. The second place defense in the playoffs right now is the Minnesota Timberwolves, who are allowing 106.8 points per 100 possessions. So that is a 5.2 point per possession gap. And that is the biggest gap between the number 1 defense and the number 2 defense in the tracking era, which started in 1996-97. So if you go through from the 1997 playoffs all the way until now, there is no team that has a bigger gap from the number 1 spot to the number 2 spot than the Thunder currently compared to the Timberwolves. And that just shows you the level that this defense has been at. It also shows you partly how bad the Memphis Grizzlies were in round 1. I say all that to say that OKC has a clear identity where even if Shea is having an off game, even if J-Dub and Chet are not performing as the number 2s or number 3s, they can rely on their defense, and they play 8 to 10 guys, and most of them are at least above average, if not good to great defensively. And that allows them to have something to fall back on regardless of how their offense is functioning. And when I look at the Lakers, I look at the first round and I ask, what was their identity? right? Like we thought we knew going into the playoffs that they had a certain identity of the switch heavy defense, the rotating, the swarming, and the collectively protecting the rim with their small ball group. And then offensively, it's going to be a lot of Luka, high pick and roll, but also some three-man actions with Luka, LeBron, and Austin. Austin having his own pick and roll chops, and LeBron just being LeBron. He can, Swiss Army knife it and just function in a multitude of ways offensively. But when I look at the playoffs and the way it played out, the Lakers didn't really have an identity in that first round. There wasn't a calling card. There wasn't something that they could rely on game to game. They just didn't really have things on either side of the ball that were reliable, that were consistent. I think for the Lakers, the thing going into next season, and part of this is you remade the team on the fly. And this is why, in general, I'm against the notion of let's just wait till the trade deadline, try to get the best deal possible and remake the team, because I always think there are consequences to that. And the consequence is you are trying to remake a group, a rotation, and form identities with like 30 games left in the season, which is tough to do. And it often leads to underperformance, underachieving, and then being like, well, next season we'll finally do it, right? And you keep kicking the can down the road, which I think the Lakers have done to various extents over the past few years. So I think for the Lakers, looking at Oklahoma City and how their defensive versatility, they have multiple rim protectors, they have multiple wing defenders, they have multiple point of attack, wreak havoc, 94 feet guys who can pick guys up and pick them at half court or force them into certain passes that lead to transition opportunities. Their defense is their superpower. And I think the Lakers need to figure out what their superpower is. And part of that comes from forming an identity. And I don't think they had a proper identity on both sides of the ball. I think there were flashes of it, but this one to me is going to be key in terms of how they build the roster, the way they build their offensive and defensive systems, just their style of play, like what type of team do they want to be? They just didn't have an identity or a good identity, right? Like they had a bad identity in the playoffs. And I think they need to go back to the drawing board and figure out what that's going to be. And if we wanted to say that the Lakers offense was supposed to be their identity, right? The three-headed monster of Luka, LeBron, and Austin, and the ways that those guys could attack you off the dribble, out of pick and rolls, out of various actions. That's great in theory. And we saw some of that down the stretch of the regular season, but we did not see that in the postseason. Like if that's the way they want to attack this, if they really believe in the Luka, LeBron, Austin core, and it's going to be building around those three pillars, as Rob Pelinka said at the exit interview, that's fine. It's just then you need to build a roster that is going to supplement that and is going to amplify that. And it's going to need to be defensive guys who can do the dirty work and play with a certain level of motor. But it also needs to be a certain level of shooting and spacing, and guys who can shoot high 30s, low 40s on threes consistently, can attack closeouts, can offensive rebound, can do the things that will help Luka, LeBron, and Austin do what they need to do offensively. So I think the Lakers have a lot to figure out in terms of their identity, forming one in theory, and then putting that in application with the roster and the style of play. And that is going to be one of the more fascinating things this summer, is how they go about theorizing that and then how they go about implementing it. Lesson number 3 is from the Minnesota Timberwolves, and it's bigger is still better. And last year's lesson for the Wolves was size still matters. So we're sensing a theme here. And if you look at their roster and their rotation, one of the key advantages they have in almost any matchup is their physicality advantages in head-to-head matchups. So with the exception of Mike Conley, of course, who's listed at just 6 feet, but even Mike Conley has a 6'7" wingspan, so he's deceptively longer than you think he is. Everyone else, if you're putting Dante DiVincenzo or Nickeil Alexander-Walker at point guard, those guys are big for the point guard position. Anthony Edwards is one of the most athletic and physically gifted players in the league, so he's going to have a certain advantage at the shooting guard spot. Jaden McDaniels is a 6'9" small forward. Reminds me a lot of Trevor Ariza, and he has a physical advantage most of the time at small forward. You have Julius Randle, who's a 6'9" bowling ball. And even if he doesn't have the physical advantage, he's going to create it by accelerating and generating momentum and then lowering his shoulder into you and powering through. And then you have Rudy Gobert, who is 7'2", one of the biggest players in the league, 4-time defensive player of the year, one of the league's better rebounders and rim protectors. So you look at that and like Minnesota has physical advantages in almost any matchup that they face. And as the Lakers can attest to in their 5-game loss to the Wolves, that still matters. Like basketball has trended over the last few years toward big men being more impactful than they were in, say, like the mid 2010s. Two big looks are back in vogue. And I think I look at a team like the Timberwolves, and they shifted their roster construction from last season, specifically replacing Karl Anthony Towns and Kyle Anderson with Julius Randle and Dante DiVincenzo. And they technically got smaller from a sheer height perspective, but they got stronger and more physical when looking at the style of play with Julius Randle compared to Towns and Dante DiVincenzo compared to Kyle Anderson. And looking at the Lakers, of course, the big need this offseason is a center. I would contend that they need at least 2 centers, if not potentially 3. I think 2 or 3 would be ideal. 1 to me is the bare minimum. And I've mentioned this before, but the more I think about it, the Lakers have just not properly prioritized the center position in years. You could argue since the championship defense season, they have not really done a good job of supplementing the roster with rotation caliber centers. It's been a revolving door of vet minimum options. And despite Anthony Davis and LeBron James wanting some interior help, wanting them to get a center that could slot AD to the 4. And I understand the Lakers' rationale to an extent because there are limited roster building resources. And if you're going to use that on a center, like at the end of the day, crunch time, AD is going to be closing at the 5 or should be closing at the 5. That was always going to be LA's best look, even during the championship season. AD at the 5, LeBron at the 4. But I think they took the we'll just live with minimum centers a little bit too far. And if you look at the cast of characters they've had, it's just been one of the worst center groups in the league for several years now. And they need to address that in a big way this summer. The Lakers have positional size. That was one of the keys to their centerless group working was you have Luka starting at point guard at 6'8", 250, whatever he is. You have LeBron, even at the 4, has physical advantages against most bigs. Maybe not Julius Randle, but like most forwards, LeBron is going to have an advantage over. Looking at Rui and Dorian Finney-Smith, like they had 4 power forwards in the top 6 of the rotation. So there was an element there of multiple guys 6'7" and above, 6'8" and above, and a certain level of strength and power with those 4 players. With the starting group and the top 6, top 7 of the rotation, there was a baseline level of size and power and strength, and the Lakers were able to go smaller, quote unquote, but stay relatively big with, again, I think in that centerless group, having 4 power forwards out there. Like that's not a small lineup. However, we saw there are degrees to size and strength and physicality and those advantages. And Minnesota just big boyed them. They bullied them. They overpowered them. It looked like varsity versus JV at times during that series. So I think for the Lakers, it's going to have to be finding a way to upgrade the starting center spot and then likely adding another backup center that brings a certain level of physicality. And as I mentioned in a recent mailbag, I think my ideal offseason for the Lakers would look something like getting a Nick Claxton or a Daniel Gafford as the starting center, and then maybe a Steven Adams or a Day'Ron Sharpe as a backup center, and just finding that balance there of having the defensive anchor as the starter and then having a more physically imposing backup center to give you a couple of different looks there. And that is something that the Lakers really need to prioritize. And if you look at the West, OKC's not going away. They have Chet and Hartenstein. Denver's not going away. They have Jokic and Gordon. Minnesota's not going away. They have Randle and Gobert And we'll see what happens with Naz Reid and his free agency situation. Houston has Şengün and potentially Adams, depending on what he does in free agency. So like the top teams in the West have a certain level of size. You could throw Memphis in there. You could throw Dallas in there. Like bigs are back in a big way, especially in the West. And the Lakers need to be able to match up with that. And to be clear, it's fine to have the centerless look in your toolkit, and it can be a valuable weapon in certain contexts. And we saw it down the stretch of the regular season against OKC, against Houston, against Memphis, against Dallas. LA was able to go smaller and dictate the terms of engagement, but that can't be your only option. And as we saw against Minnesota, that became LA's only option. So I think for LA, prioritizing physical advantages, prioritizing size and athleticism and strength, prioritizing rebounding, that's been something they have not prioritized well over the last few years. They need to be a better rebounding team. No rebounds, no rings, as Pat Riley once said. Like that needs to be part of the calculus into building this roster. Your lone look in the playoffs was a centerless look. You need to not have that be your only pitch. You need to have a more versatile center look, maybe a bruising, powerful center look, and then also the centerless look. And if you have those three options, then you can match up with just about anybody. And so I think that needs to finally be a priority for the Lakers this offseason. And the fourth and final lesson from the conference finalists is from the Indiana Pacers, and it is strength in numbers. And if you look at Indiana, they're doing things a bit unconventionally in terms of the depth of their rotation in these playoff series. In the first round against Milwaukee, they played 11 players double-digit minutes. In the second round against the Cavs, they played 10 players double-digit minutes. So through the first two rounds, they are averaging a 10.5-man rotation, which is rare in 2025. It's also rare in general in a playoff context. Most coaches go 7 to 8 players, maybe 9 at most, but going 10 or even 11 is uncommon. And I think that speaks to the job that the Pacers did building their roster. They do lean starter heavy, with the starters typically playing 30 plus minutes, or the top 6 or so playing 30 plus minutes. And then players 7 to 10 or 7 to 11 are more so in that like 10 to 16, 10 to 18 minute range. But that has been an advantage for them in the first couple rounds. You look at Milwaukee and their lack of depth. You look at Cleveland and what ultimately became their lack of depth due to both injuries and underperformance by their supporting cast. Indiana was just able to come at both of those teams in waves and run them off the floor, and doing so while not having the best player in the series. Because if you look at the first round, Giannis was the best player in that series, but it didn't matter. Indiana still won. The second round, Donovan Mitchell was the best player in the series. Didn't matter. Indiana still won. And they're doing so without having a quote unquote top 10 player. Like, I think Tyrese Haliburton is knocking on that door. He's making a case to be a back end top 10 player. And maybe by the end of these playoffs, he will be considered that. If they go to the finals, if they win the championship, it's hard to keep him out of the top 10. But you compare that with Mitchell, who I think for a lot of people would be somewhere between like the 8 or 9 to 12 or 13 range, somewhere like borderline top 10 guy. And then Giannis, who's a top 3 player in the league, if not top 2. Clearly those teams had the star power, but it didn't matter because Indiana has a certain level of depth, guys who fill specific roles and fill them adequately. And I think the lesson here for the Lakers is we saw in game 4 when the chips were down, when the season was on the line, JJ Redick only relied on 5 players. And outside of that game, it really was like 7 for the series. And so I think one of the things that the Lakers have to do a better job of is building the back end of the roster. And this has been an issue for them for years, similar to the center position. But specifically looking at this year, you look at Shake Milton, Markieff Morris, Alex Len, Maxi Kleber coming off an injury, missing 3 months, Bronny James. Like, they did not have reliable rotation level players at spots 11 to 15 on this roster. That has been something that has been an issue going back multiple years. And I think they need to do a better job of hitting on some of these minimum guys or letting go of them, right? Because I go back, I've made this point before, but the Lakers had a shot to get Gary Trent Jr. last summer if they were willing to waive Cam Reddish or Christian Wood and eat the money and get a much better vet minimum player. but they chose not to. Then they had to anyway during the course of the season to add Jordan Goodwin and Alex Len. And for as much as I like Jordan Goodwin, he's not Gary Trent Jr. He did not give the Lakers the level of production that Gary Trent Jr. gave the Bucks. So I think the Lakers have to do a better job this summer of figuring out the back end of the roster, taking some swings on young guys with potential. You look at that group outside of Bronny, none of those guys really have upside. Maxi Kleber is on the back end of his career as a rotation guy. Alex Len and Markieff Morris didn't look like NBA level players last year. Shake Milton looked borderline. So I think the Lakers have to do a better job of building the depth of the roster, building the back end of the roster. And you're not going to hit on every vet minimum guy, but I think sometimes they've chased names, they've chased guys who used to be good or decent, and it needs to be more about uncovering gems and guys who can pop within your rotation. It's not to say they haven't done that. Like I give them credit for Jordan Goodwin. I think that was a nice find. I think Trey Jemison, Christian Koloko, maybe one of those guys ends up on the roster next season and they can contribute in a more meaningful way. So I think they've done well with the scouting with younger players and the two-way guys and the draft and whatnot, but I think they need to do a better job with some of the vet minimum contracts. And I mentioned this in a recent mailbag, like if we're talking about the ideal Lakers offseason and what maximizing next year's roster looks like, it's going to have to come to some extent in the form of hitting on minimum guys, getting minimum guys to either take a discount or because of the market. A guy like a Gary Trent last summer, we'll see who that player is this summer, but can you find a couple of those guys and offer them the Lakers platform and say, hey, if you perform well, we'd love to keep you, but if we can't, you at least, like Lakers role players who perform well get a certain level of spotlight, a certain level of status that other teams' role players just don't get because the Lakers are the Lakers and they have a certain brand and a platform, and it's different, right? And we've seen guys rebuild their careers with the Lakers. I think Malik Monk is probably the best example of this, but guys go on to have different opportunities because they played for the Lakers and played well there. And of course, you want to prioritize continuity, and you don't want to just sign guys for them to leave necessarily, but you do need to hit with some of the minimum guys. And one of the ways to do that is to leverage what you can offer that other teams can't. And the benefits to a deeper roster are numerous. In the regular season, you can withstand injuries better. You could tinker with lineups and rotations and styles of play, test different things out. And in the playoffs, it allows you greater versatility because you have different looks that you can go to, and you can keep your stars and your starters fresher, and you don't have to play them all 24 minutes in a half, which I think just shows the Lakers and the Pacers are on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of roster construction and depth. But to recap, I think there are many things to take away from each conference finalist, but specifically for the Lakers, I think the biggest lessons are from the Knicks, the heliocentric blueprint, the way to put the right role players around Luka moving forward. From the Thunder, the power of identity. LA needs to figure out its identity, its calling card, and lean more into that going into next season. From the Minnesota Timberwolves, bigger is still better. LA needs to get bigger. They need to add a center or two and make that a priority for next season. And then from the Indiana Pacers, strength in numbers. LA needs to get deeper. They need to improve the back end of the roster, give JJ Redick more options for the regular season and the playoffs. But that'll do it for today's show. Thank you all so much for watching and listening. For those watching on YouTube, please be sure to hit that subscribe button, turn on channel notifications, and like and comment on this video. For those listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcast platform of choice, please be sure to follow, download, and leave a 5-star review. I'll be back later in the week with a new episode with a guest and a live Q&A. I will talk to you then.